Om Satyanandam. Om Tat Sat. Om, God speaking to God about God, directly, as there is no other way. Om, the 10th live stream, teachings of SATYAVEDISm. Om, entitled Om Satya, the 5 main obstacles to self-realization, Lssv 10. Om, welcome to God in the form of God myself, Gitvote, or have just seemingly found Satyavedism anew. Om. There are a few main points to be made that are very important in being able to receive this God information directly without seeming obstacles in the way of the actual information itself. Now, projectioning is what would be considered normal phenomenon, which is overlaying prior seeming information, seemingly accumulated information upon God reality in any form, even in the form of God information that is supposed to be beneficial to realization, to breaking through all of that projectioning, the very projectioning itself. So in order to receive this God information in God consciousness, it needs to be said, needs to be stated very emphatically that there has to be at least an attempt to drop down that seeming filtering, or what might be called defense mechanisming, to seemingly new information incoming. Now, of course, the God information is everywhere, and it is absorbed in God consciousness no matter what else is phenomening seemingly in its way. It goes straight to God consciousness because that's all that there is. But this information specifically needs to be mentioned in order to possibly have some diminishing of that projectioning. So the God information is usually received by what would be called intellectual or thought methods. That seems to be the primary mechanism, seemingly. So when information is given, there has to be all this thought about it. How does it compare to this other information that is accumulated Does it sound in harmony with it? Does it sound juxtaposed to it? Does it sound harsh against it? Is it something that the words seemingly do not make sense to when compared to previous seeming information that is in fact projectioning in the eternal now? It is not actually previous information, because all God information is eternally now activating. That's the only way it can be working, activating now. So this information, when there is information seemingly incoming into consciousness, there can be that that interplay with other seeming information that is more familiar. So this teaching is that in order to actually absorb this information, not only within God consciousness, because God consciousness itself accepts all. It always accepts all. There is nothing that can ever be turned away from God consciousness, because everything is within it. So the God consciousness is accepting all, and so this is all absorbed within it. But the mind thought mechanism phenomenon needs to not accept it as that information only, as intellectual information, as information that is to be thought and taken on and assimilated within thought only. Because these teachings, God in the form of these teachings, this God information, is to transcend all of that thought. It is about direct realization. It's not about thought realization. Thought is utilized in these processes, but that is not the primary way in which it is used. Because in fact, in direct realization, thought has to be dropped in order to really get to the core of what you are. You, as the one I. So, attempt at dropping down or alleviating or dissipating some of that projectioning in order to actually absorb this God information without overlay. Otherwise, it can be misunderstood. It can be distorted, or it could possibly be rejected. And then there will not be the benefit of it if there is turning away from it. So there has to be real attentiveness and sort of relaxed concentration on this information. Without the mind rising up to meet it and, compare it to something. God information is beyond comparison. There is nothing to compare it to. The second main God information that needs to be stated to continue is that these seeming teachings, if they're seemingly individualized as one teaching and another teaching, or a progression of teachings, and they're seemingly out of context, meaning God consciousness meets this information in a seeming particular object of a single teaching, which is not true, it's in fiction, and then starts to jump to conclusions. The mind, thought, processes, again, intervene and start to jump to conclusions about what this teaching means, and what it may be lacking, or again, how it may be contradictory to other information, etc., and make snap judgments about that information without having accessed the plenitude of God information that is available and ready to activate and is activating in eternity right now of Satya and SATYAVEDISM teachings. It is unlikely that one teaching will be a primary example of all the content of God information that is available for absorption. So the mind racing to conclusions about a particular teaching is not in any context of the whole. So let that be stated. The teachings should be absorbed in various ways, either by what is called reading, or watching, listening, and reabsorbed, contemplated, absorbed, reabsorbed, practiced, directly realized, reassimilated, reabsorbed. In other words, the teachings are not for one-time consumption, say, and then on to the next one, and then on to the next one, and on to the next one. Just like what happens in fiction primarily is that there are these cravings for this and this and this and this and this and that and this, and it's endless. It's always on to the next one, as if the other one has been consumed and it's no longer in sight, and then there's the need for something else. It's always something else. Gratification. There's always this need for gratification over and over and over again. Let this be stated that self-realization can either be extremely easy, and yes, it can be. It can happen in an instant in eternity and blow everything away. Or it can be seemingly take years in eternity that are in fact not real. With this path and that path, and trying this and trying that, and attempting this and having this experience and having that experience, and an endless string of attempts and wanting peak experiences that are ephemeral. And that none of that is the real self. So all of that is still within dreaming. So all of these teachings are readily available. They are phenomenon throughout God Omniverse. They are the teachings are active. They activate in consciousness. There is no such thing as a past teaching or a teaching from some time long ago and a fresh new teaching. All of that is illusion. Is all within some story that doesn't exist. It's all within dreaming. All of these teachings are activating right now in eternity. They're ever present. And the teachings can be utilized at any moment. And reabsorbed. So seek out, or whatever, come to any of these teachings and activate them directly in consciousness at any time in eternity. And refrain from basing a whole, coming to some conclusion based upon one seeming teaching out of so many of them, of the teachings. Because those conclusions would be fiction. And there are to be many, many more, God willing, scriptures and live stream teachings and various other teachings. But those teachings are not consumables. And the teachings are all readily available, always. So absorb, study, apply them, apply the teachings, and make no assumptions. Thirdly, God is eternal as God absolute. What is called the absolute is God and all else. And that you, as the one I, are God eternal, the absolute. And this is to be realized. There is self-realization and God realization. You, the self, or as God, have never been born and have never and will never die. That is a misidentification with a body form. And you are not limited to a tiny little body form. So this hypnotism of the body hallucination has to be transcended. You as God have to live as God, not as a body. You are not within a body. The body and all the other bodies and everything else is within you, God. and this is to be realized. The barriers to self-realization, which is a stage, seemingly, to God realization, are the following. 1, and primary, language. Language. 2, sensory vision. Of the body senses, the main one, that's the barrier, is ocular, it's vision. 3, the primary pseudo-egoing process. There is no ego. There is no person. It is an illusory process. It's a recapitulating process. 4, the collective pseudo-egoing process. And 5, species centrism and fiction. Those are the 5 main obstacles to self-realization. Now, there are to be many teachings that are to go into each one of these in particular in order to assist this deconstruction and dehypnotism, this deprogramming. So that the true self, which is always already realized, can be directly known without all of that all of these processes in the way, seemingly. So this all involves understanding the mechanics and dynamics of consciousness, of what seemingly is local consciousness, what the contents are, how that functioning actually occurs in order to see through it. Now, God, in the form of most that believe that there are persons mostly do not investigate these processes that are readily available for investigation. It's basically investigating the mechanics. And it involves a form of witnessing words, sentences, that form within consciousness and images, and trace those phenomenon back to source. But the mechanics actually has to be investigated. So this is the most direct way to get to self-realization. There are many other seeming paths that do not really exist, because the real self does not need to travel a path or paths. There is nowhere to go. So this is a sort of tracing back to source by following the mechanics in what seemingly is in. Now again, there is no in, there is no out, there are no directions. But as long as there is belief in being a body or a personality, then that will feel like something. So what is called going in, instead of being constantly having attention on what is called world, the exterior, and never really investigating what is seemingly within. That investigation is a science of sorts, although it need not be complicated, though. But it can be likened to a scientific investigation of the inner mechanics of consciousness, within consciousness. And then it starts to become very clear what is actually going on in there. And then there's a breaking out, a breaking past and through that phenomenon to a realization that there is no location where you are. It is dimensionless, but all dimensions are within it. And there is access to all dimensions within it. So those limitations get blown away. But as long as there's hypnotism of believing that there is the limitation of personage and body, then that hypnotism will reconfigure constantly. And there's all sorts of seeming consequences, primarily to body functioning and health. So direct realization, it can be quite simple because it is natural. It is what you are. Or it can be very complicated because you're attached to all those and believe that thought content and find it very difficult to drop it or disorienting. But mainly it's an attachment. because basically it's a fear. It's a fear of the unknown. The mind, thought content, cannot know what you are directly. It cannot think what you are into something small, because what you are cannot be contained by anything. So it's a futile attempt to try to think to realization. Although thinking, when used as a practice or tool of sorts, can assist. But self-realization cannot be thought. Because if there is an attempt or a misunderstanding, and there is a phenomenon that occurs where the pseudo-self phenomenon gets to a point where it'll want to throw off a seeming persona, but then it wants to try on, without knowing, the persona of self-realized person that isn't a person, or trying to live self-realization. It's an attempt to think self-realization, and it's bound to fail because it is a temporary processing that has to be maintained, and it cannot be. At some point, it tires out of trying to maintain what is called self-realization. So it's sort of the pseudo-ego process always wants to claim for itself what is happening. And that is the part of the spiritual processing of in the dreaming. It's a continuation of the dreaming, only it's this attempt to get out of the dreaming by creating states that it misunderstands as realization or getting to realization. Like it cannot do it. That process has to be dissolved, and then the real self knows itself already, but it becomes apparent. It becomes obvious. So the pseudo-egoing, it has to end. Though now thought is not the problem, quote unquote. It is not the problem. It is not about not thinking again. Even if the self is realized as that it is not this and it is not that, and neti, it eliminates all of, there's elimination of all of the various sorts of fiction. Then if it's held there, it's artificial. Because all is the self, all is God. There is nothing that is not. So that processing is to clear, is to make a clearance for what is always here. So that becomes obvious. And then self-realization then can lead to God realization, which is realization of the whole and all of the manifestation within God whole, the absolute, within all, and how all of that works, or how it all functions, how it all and then as God, the possibilities are endless. All potentialities are available to be manifest. So it breaks out from there. But in order to get to the knowing of the self, of self-realization, and then of God as God, these seeming barriers have to be, in a sense, removed. So there are practices that can be done to assist, and God is doing all of this. So there is no pseudo-self doing these practices in order to get to realization. This is why in Satya emphasizes over and over again that this is not about getting to something that you are not. It is not about becoming divine. It is not about becoming anything from some other place. Because, again, you are already that. So it is about simply realizing what you are. So it is the other way around. You're clearing in order to see and know directly, and not through thought. So again, the barriers are language, 1, language, 2, sensory vision, 3, primary pseudo-egoing process, 4, collective pseudo-egoing process, and 5, species centrism and fiction. Now that may seem like a lot, but some of those they're interrelated. And there'll be many teachings of processings, of procedures that can be implemented in order to see through. But there'll be some primary practices, and then there'll be secondary, tertiary, and all that. You can focus on main practices, and then if other practices that are also presented can assist, then those practices should be taken on as well. But the main in God in the Form and Happening of SATYAVEDISM, the practices and teachings to realization, they must basically be simple and effective. If there is overcomplication, then it leads to all sorts of tangential and then off off this, doing that, and that is a primary seeming problem with a lot of spirituality, is that there is so much that becomes offered, that it lends itself to non-focus. This is all about focusing. The investigation, it has to be taken very seriously. If there is wanting self-realization and God-realization, then it has to be of primary importance. It can't just be some activity of many that get done and compartmentalized as part of an overall itinerary of life functioning or something. It has to be really of primary importance and taken very seriously, because then it can be done what is called in eternity. It can seem to manifest quickly. Of course, it happens in eternity, so there is no time about it. Ultimately, that is seen through. But in fiction, it feels like, what it feels like would be that it could happen quickly. It seriously could happen quickly, but it involves a great bit of focus on it for that sort of manifestation. Otherwise, it can be sort of like all other seeming phenomenon, just sort of randomly seemingly in fiction, sort of randomly occurring. And then that leads to what the feeling of it maybe taking years to happen. And that's needless. It really is. It really has to do with focus and not being distracted by species fiction. And you have to want it above all else, to know yourself, your true self. Because that true self, when a body appeared, seemingly, and it started to grow, seemingly, there were no preconceived notions and thoughts and concepts and language within it, within the consciousness. That all grew. That all was added on and retained, and led to the hypnosis. That was not innate. It is not innate. It can be dropped. Just like it is always already there. So it's a matter of actually dropping what was picked up and grew, what grew. The species fiction ultimately leads to all seeming sorts of unhappiness and illness. It's basically what would be considered mental illness. Normal functioning is basically mental illnesses, and which manifest in the body and make the body ill in various ways. And then substances that get consumed that cause other illnesses in conjunction, and then it just all these processes feed upon themselves or whatever, and cause all sorts of havoc basically. And then so basically the species centrism, since that the pseudo-egoing affects the primary pseudo-egoing, then is influenced by the collective pseudo-egoing, and all the species centric information is exchanged and retained and believed, and then it leads to all sorts of mental and physical illness. So although that when there is self-realization and God realization, that all of that is seen through, and it's almost like this unbelievable, like how could that actually be occurring? It seems so ridiculous. It almost sometimes can manifest as being humorous, like that. It just seems ridiculously. It's just ridiculous. But if it causes the bodies to be ill, and to God transmutation to occur seemingly before the fullness of the potentiality of the body's being, then it can also seem tragic, like so much waste of potentiality. There is so much God potentiality, God manifesting that can be done once the God transcension is in full force, and all the manifestation is occurring with clarity, and without when the curing for this illness starts to be widespread, then although the pseudo-egoing will disappear, then it will cease to be, and the God thought processing is to be used for much higher purposes, for what is actually supposed to be used for, before it gets diverted into a sort of spiraling downward of centrism on smallness. So when that is broken through and it's done, and the God transcension happens in this seemingly what would be called en masse, then there is the unlimited omnipotence, and God intelligence is to manifest in full force, and the illnesses are to be cured. So the pseudo-egoing processing is to be cleared. What is called what seems to be the self, the false self, those false selves are to disappear upon realization. And the body phenomenon, all the seeming body phenomenons, will be greatly relieved. Because health will start to be restored to them, to the bodies, God in the form of the bodies. They'll be greatly relieved. Of course, they'll be purging, though. There's to be purging, as in all forms of purification. Almost like with illnesses, that there's the purging of the seeming invasive phenomenon. It gets purified out of the system. So in the same way, some of these processes, some of these practices are a form of purging illness. But basically the benefit to the bodies is sort of like a residual fallout of the realization. It's relief from the havoc that the illusion has created. If it weren't for the physical dis-ease that is caused by not knowing the true self, perhaps it would not be seemingly problematic. But as long as there is actual seeming suffering going on, what is called the thought suffering is an illusion. Thought suffering can be ceased at immediately. It can actually be immediately in eternity. But there is attachment to suffering. There is an attachment to great peak experience as well. Great, wonderful peak experience, exhilaration, etc. There are all sorts of seeming attachments. But there is also attachment to suffering. Because there is some, when there's hypnotism and the pseudo-selfing, when there is not any other seeming source of knowledging, and that's all that is known and all that has been processed, then and that is the identification with self, and there is no other real seemingly direct knowledge of anything else, then there's attachment to whatever that self seems to be, even if it is suffering. Because to drop that would create fear of the unknown. So there can actually be attachment to suffering. Even though it would seem counterintuitive to wanting to throw off suffering, why would the self want to continue to suffer, right? But in fact, it is. There is attachment. Because there is no, that's all it seems to have known. It's used to it. It's used to this reoccurring process. So there's all sorts of seeming attachment. But basically the attachment is seeking objects, it's seemingly seeking external objects in order to get some sort of satisfaction, some merging with those objects that somehow or other that will bring joy, that will bring happiness. The next thing, and it seems to feel like that. It feels like something like that. So that wanting, that craving those objects, basically that keeps occurring because that's the resultant happiness that comes from them, the objects. But then when there's the in-between objects, and then there's this wanting phenomenon that occurs, this feeling of wanting something because it's in between objects. It wants the next one. It wants the next. It wants another source. But the source is not the source of the happiness or the satisfaction is not the objects. But there's the pseudo-selfing does not cannot usually see through that. It usually doesn't not. That peace, that natural satiety or bliss or happiness, some of these words, again, language cannot express it. It comes from the source. It does not come from the object. It comes from the source that is in the object and in everything else. It's internal to consciousness, but not in an object. So once that's seen through, then there is no more craving for what seems to be external, because everything is yourself. So there is no one particular object then that is craved, because it's all yourself. You have it already. You have everything already. That is the truth. That is the truth of the self, the truth of God reality. That's why it seems ridiculous, ultimately. There are so many ways that it seems ridiculous. But again, as long as it is creating this not knowing, seemingly knowing the self directly, as long as it is creating seemingly the manifestation of that lack of seeming knowledge creates unhappiness or suffering, then this God information has to be propagated. It has to be widespread. It has to be known. It has to be implemented so that the suffering can cease, and then it's on to all the wonderful creativity that occurs and can exponentially occur. God manifestation, God power, not disempowerment, not smallness. It's just you are so much more than you, small you, realize, if there is still phenomenon of the pseudo-personality. If the pseudo-personality has been seen through and it is not there anymore, that functioning, that processing is no longer there, and it is seemingly dropped, then that's wonderful. But what actually is, it occurs in God realization is that all is myself. So as long as all is myself, and there seems to be suffering of other seeming pseudo-ego-ing bodies, the key here is the actual phenomenon of the bodies. Then this must be cleared. It's of utmost importance that this needless suffering ceases. It must. There's so much that can be done with God intelligence. It's so amazingly awesome. There is so much that can be done. You have that power. If you do not know that because you are misidentified with a pseudo-egoing process, then get it out of the way. And then start to clear it in the sight of elsewhere as well. There is no individual. There are no individuals. There's no such thing as a species. So all of these barriers have to be gone through one by one or put together or whatever. But primarily, the primary barrier is language. Not in the form of bodies when first occur, there is no awareness of language. And there's no diminishment. There's no smallness there. There's no understanding of smallness. There is no conceptualizing of anything small. That's introduced. That is not a priori. That is added on. It is a manifestation of ignorance added on within consciousness. It is not innate. So what was added on can be dropped off. Yeah, it's an unlearning process. You have learned the wrong information. You basically need to be dehypnotized. You need to unlearn that information and then substitute it with God truth content. But before that, there has to be realization of what you actually are. Because it's not about taking a pseudo-ego and feeding it with new information in order for that pseudo-egoing process to continue in some other manifest formationing. It's not about swapping egos, like seemingly in the God in the happening of what is called acting. Where seemingly a pseudo-ego process takes on another pseudo-ego process role. There are also, with pseudo-egoing, there's not just one particular ego in there, seemingly. There can be all sorts of fragmentationing of egoing, based on contextualization of functioning, like what is called in species fiction, where there's employment situations or there's education situations where there has to be certain behavior that seemingly is suitable and manifest, and in sort of a molding conformity. And so there are certain behavioring processes that are considered appropriate in certain contexts. So the primary pseudo-egoing process does not seemingly form one particular ego that is maintained. There's no such thing as it's not maintained. It's fragmented all over the place. That's why the investigation, the investigation to go in and see the mechanics of all this, it'll then become obvious that there is no formed ego. It's a process, and there's all sorts of fragmentary information in there. So with God and the happening of something in fiction like ego acting, where a pseudo-ego takes off its persona, because it's actually a persona. It's like it is a mask. It's a projection in the way of it. That's why the word person or persona, mask, in a sense, actually conveys the meaning of what the word person denotes, in a sense. A mask. it's a filter. It's not real. And then the acting takes that other content and reconfigures the pseudo-egoing process with that information, and creates another seeming pseudo-ego, and wears that mask and acts as that small thing, and throws itself into performing as that pseudo personality, and then so on and so on. So past a certain seeming number of pseudo personalities, it becomes obvious that it's completely malleable, and in fact it is not true. At core, there is no. These are false selves that are believed in, and they are not real. None of this is real. None of that is real. It's all dreaming. There is so much more that can be used for what is called imagination. There can be a connotation of a positive connotation to imagination, and that is basically a God unlimited creativity. There's no end to that. But to believe so much information, which is basically species fiction, most species-centric information is not true. It unknowingly attempts to put limitation on what cannot be limited. So the barriers, primarily all of the barriers relate ultimately to this sort of centrism. And the vision, number two, vision has to do with the actual sensory input, believing what is seen. But most of reality cannot be seen. Most of God reality, in fact, cannot be seen. So basically, to believe in the seeming limitation of the information of sight, that basically makes up such a micro to the whatever power of tininess of the whole of God reality. Why would there continue to be attachment to that, seemingly? It seems like such a powerful sense. But the true self, and God's self, is so much more powerful, unspeakably powerful, than the power of one sensory mechanism. But yet, the sense of vision is so primary, seemingly. But all that, the beginning of that breaking through those barriers is that in the going within, seemingly, is the eyes, the vision, that form, that sort of vision. It needs to close like this. And this is the beginning of the investigation. Because what you are is so much more than can be seen by the sense of vision, by the actual physical sense of vision. Now there is another form of vision that does not have to do with the senses, and that is to be expounded upon in other teachings. So the surrendering one of the barriers, which is belief in the sensory input of the vision mechanism. You have to be willing, God willing. Language is to evolve. It has, in a sense, devolved in various phases. So the tech, God Intel tech, is ever expanding, and the use of language, although there are seemingly more and more words added on, used, the purpose of language is being devalued, it's being devolved. That needs to be balanced and reversed. So the primary barrier is the misuse of language. Language is used, it's basically a slicing up of reality. Well, unbeknownst attempt at slicing up reality, because the secondary barrier, they're interrelated, because seeing differences, seemingly, that the language is grown out of the visual seeming differences in order to make denotations of all of the variations and all of the things, seemingly. So it's just a ever slicing up of, and it's exactly the opposite in a sense of reality, which is unitive. It's that all God is all one, or non-dual, and that the seeming multiplicity, even scientifically, can be seen at micro nano, as not being differentiated. So the illusion is that. Then the language basically conveys all of that. And so the language is used, and that causes basically the hypnotization of that everything is all over the place and all separate. Language is usually used as separative. So is it any wonder that the real self, which has and is not separated in any way, would seemingly be masked in some way by language? Seemingly. So there has to be an evolution of language. Because in the evolution, the God transcension, the more all the pseudo-egoing processes are dissipated, the more then there'll be a direct need to express this reality in ways that are not just as other systems have been ultimately discarded when they were no longer useful. And evolution has occurred on many levels with all of that God information. So too is what is to occur with language. So there has to be the attention to language. Most God in the form of in fiction or relativity, there's the use of language without, for the most part, without actually even thinking about language. There's some seeming God in the form of education that occurs that gives some information about language and how to use it in very simply practical methods of what would be called learning what words mean, how to use grammars or whatever. And then from then on, it just takes off, and language gets used because of the collective hypnotism. Language is used primarily by a sort of copy and paste method. It's learned. There are phrases that are used, and they tend to be sort of glued together, strung together. Phrases sort of copied and pasted and glued together as flowing sentence and paragraph structuring, and then somehow or other the pseudo-personality thinks or believes that it's actually speaking true feelings with true thought or true feelings of individualness are somehow occurring and being expressed, but all of it sounds very similar. When there is real attention to language, it becomes obvious that a lot of it is used in mimicry. So, or imitation in a sense. So when all of these sort of phrases and cliches, when true attention to language direct from consciousness, from God consciousness, and this will be gone into, there are some major teachings about how language actually emanates from God consciousness. For instance, through Paravak and Prashanti, etc., there are modes, there are sort of topographies or terrains to be investigated, but it's all one. There aren't divisions of it. But how thought emanates, how language comes from consciousness and then comes out into direct expression. So when there is attention to that, then the use of language it drastically changes in that way. It manifests very differently than the sort of the inattentive use of language. It's like, it is sort of like within the dream phenomenon, in what is called a dream state. It's like that they're speaking within the dream, within dreaming, without really knowing what is actually being said, in a sense. So it's taking on these phrases and putting them together, and then pseudo ego is claiming individuality about expression and feeling, but it's kind of like that is the constriction sort of that it can only express and feel. It is not true expression. It's sort of generic mimicry, copying of what seems to be true expression, and taking it on and expressing it out as it ends up being a sort of straitjacketing of in dreaming, a sort of straitjacketing of the potentiality of real expression. There's so much that can be expressed, God thought and God speech as truth content. It does not have that cliched sort of speech. It comes straight from direct. It emanates directly from the true self. In the evolution of education in many ways, language evolution and it must be taught in the evolution of education as being a primary focus, like linguistics and language, the evolution of language, in order to express reality, not the dream. We don't need more dream language. We need real language. Real language. There's so much, so many teachings. This needs to be simple. You need to make simple what is not, what has been unnecessarily been complicated and convoluted. I mean, real complexity is real complexity. God is endlessly complex. But fiction complexity fictional complexity turns to nightmares in the dreaming. So these main barriers, again, will be gone into one by one and extensively. There's the language, vision, primary pseudo-egoing, collective pseudo-egoing, species fiction, centrism, basically. Have to overstand the mechanics and the dynamics of all of this phenomenological occurring. Attention, focus, attention. It has to be really wanted. Directly knowing the true self, it should never be any other way. It should never have come into such seeming hypnotism or ignorance or not being actually having access somehow or other to the God information to get that, to then want to So a lot of this is about deconstruction, to breaking that all apart. And again, it does not have to be complicated. It is about simplifying. Yes, there are complexities. Yes, yes, yes. And there'll be many different methods and practices. And then if one particular practice does somehow or other does not seem suitable for some reason, then another practice can be taken up. But there'll be some main central practices that basically will be core. And then to come, the what is called pancha, the 5 practices in Geturn, in eternity, what would be considered daily, will be cardinal, Om. God in the happening of pancha, 5 practices daily, Om. That will lead to realization, and then can be continued to be practiced as worship anyway, because God worship is endless. It's a celebration of God, of yourself. Worship is a celebration of the God life that you are. It is not a duty of a pseudo-self. It is ultimately, it is not a practice. It's a celebration. Om. Satyanandam. Om. Blesses convergence in all its phenomenal aspecting, seen and unseen. Om. God alone exists. God alone is reality.